Have you heard that the U.S. Defense Secretary has just visited African countries? It has raised concern, especially because he is the military head. Therefore, he came up with schemes that will once again put Africa in bondage. He made statements that are quite unsettling for African countries. If they are not paid attention to, chances are that the U.S. will replace the former colonial masters still influencing Africa. But with what plots and plans he has come to Africa, being the person carrying out Joe Biden's policy in Africa. What controversial has he said that is more of a warning for African heads of state to come forward and take charge before things get out of hand? Let's find out. 2023 became the year when the Western world finally realized they had made blunders in Africa. Their policies, exploitative systems imposed on Africa, sanctions, blackmailing, and hypocrisy became clearer than ever. That's why we saw one after another Western leaders visiting Africa and touring the entire continent to win allies. U.S. Secretary of State, Treasury Secretary, French President, and even European monarchs like King Charles visited Africa. All this was for damage control, actions taken after extreme damages have been done. Until now, nothing seemed to work. Tens of visits by the Western leaders did not bring fruit. What's more, the African leaders made their position at the United Nations Security Council very clear. That was the moment when the West realized Africa was getting out of their hands. Since they have a colonial mentality, they believe they own Africa. Therefore, Africa has to lean on their side forever. Yet things didn't turn out as expected. African countries decided to diversify their allies, choosing countries like Russia, China, and even North Korea. That was a nightmare for the Western leaders. It was worsened when African countries like Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso kicked out French troops and even the UN peacekeepers. Now, after everything, the US has decided to do damage control. But what did the US do? Well, the US is in deep fear of Russia and its mercenaries. Therefore, it sent its defense secretary to Africa to persuade African countries to submit, make agreements, and offer military bases. However, the US did not know its plans had a different fate. Even if it sent its secretary for damage control, the tone and message said it all that the US was not thinking of any cooperation, but a relation of servant and master, as before. Since the Secretary of Defense Lloyd J. Austin's speeches were written in the US and were not his own words, they came out quite dry and cold. Austin reiterated the US military's commitment to collaborate with African allies and partners, ensuring that the continent benefits from international rules and norms that advance security and prosperity. He said that, unlike other nations, the United States sees African nations as vital partners in establishing security, stability, and freedom. But we know that it was just a lie. The US and the Western countries never considered Africa a partner. Therefore, the heads of presidents of the 54 countries were called to the US as if they were servants, instead of one man, Biden, coming to Africa if he wanted to talk. That's not how the relationship of equals is. There are no orders and obeying. You should know that this visit marked Austin's first to the continent as defense secretary, following previous visits to Djibouti and Kenya. His presence in Angola was historic as he became the first defense secretary to visit the country. This showed that things have gotten out of the US hands. Therefore, it is trying and using every option it has to win allies in Africa. Austin said that as the first Black Secretary of Defense, his presence was significant because of his background. He said that he grew up in America's segregated South during a time of legalized racial segregation. He expressed a profound belief in the potential for progress through collective efforts. You see, that's how the US uses tactics. Austin was precisely chosen as a defense secretary because he is Black, and the US had plans to go aggressive. It wanted to get things done from his hands, so there was no one to blame. Austin is the man who has been forced to carry out Biden's policies against Africa despite being Black. However, that's the choice he has made, and he has to face the criticism and consequences that come with it. Acknowledging the continent's challenges, including pandemics, food insecurity, the climate crisis, terrorism, resource exploitation, and the rise of autocracy, Austin emphasized the importance of addressing these urgent shared threats. He said that the U.S. Africa Command, tasked with collaborating with African partners, is prepared to offer support. Further branding what the U.S. wants, he said the U.S. strategy in Africa is rooted in genuine dialogues with African partners, promoting inclusivity, equality, and mutual respect. That's the moment when all African leaders would have laughed after listening to it. If there is a country that does not know what equal relationships and mutual respect are, it's the United States. It just knows how to use its allies, discarding them once benefits are achieved. But what did he say that raised eyebrows? Well, as he said, Africa's problems are development, infrastructure, and poverty. They can be resolved by real partnership, not by building military bases and increasing military deployment. Hence, if the U.S. wanted to collaborate, it should have sent the State Secretary of Commerce secretary. What was the purpose of sending a defense secretary? Well, that's because the U.S. only cares about its own interests. In this case, it is to fill the gap left by French and UN troops, repelling Russian mercenaries out. Because we all know this from the start, the U.S. is trying to sell this narrative by talking about development. But it's hard to understand how military bases and drones would bring development. Austin highlighted the necessity of open discussions to tackle security, counterterrorism, and other 21st century challenges. He emphasized the strengthening of military cooperation with African partners, focusing on deepening defense relationships grounded in equality and mutual respect. But what does deepening defense relationships mean? Until now, it has been established that Africa needs infrastructure like roads, railways, hospitals, schools, and safe cities, not weapons and military bases. So, what is the purpose of deepening defense relationships? By this, the U.S. means building more U.S. bases in African countries and deploying more U.S. troops. That's how the U.S. covers its interests, by using complex terms that people cannot understand. They think it's right to deepen defense relationships, but they don't know it means it allows the U.S. to take over the bases. It's quite hard to believe that in a single breath. Austin talked about this and upholding sovereignty. How can a country's sovereignty be protected when another country's troops are present there? What ridiculous logic applies here? Austin assured the audience that the United States respects African nations' sovereignty, cultures, and choices, emphasizing that partnerships will never be taken for granted. Note that it means they intend to do something whenever someone negates something. Austin further said that the U.S. objective is to collaborate with African countries on their terms without imposing external influence. Reversing means collaboration on American terms and pressure on Africa. But what were the hidden messages in what he said that Africa should pay attention to? Well, the whole purpose of his trip was to persuade African countries to give military bases. In that way, the U.S. could increase its military presence and at the same time increase weapon sales. It's an established thing that wherever the U.S. goes, the number of militants increases there. It's because when the U.S. troops fight, the natives have to fight back to save their land. This creates demands for weapons that the U.S. sells. In other words, the U.S. wants to make Africa a hotspot of conflicts where it could sell its weapons and offer benefits to its arms companies. We saw this happening in the Afghan War and the War on Terror in general. The U.S. spent more than $8 trillion, besides what other countries spent, because a threat perception was created. The defense secretary, in the tone of a master, conveyed that the relationship between the United States and Angola has significantly advanced in recent years. Angola is now viewed as a highly valued and capable partner, emerging as a regional leader and beyond. That was said because Angola seems to offer military bases. Once again, creating controversy, he said that the United States views African nations as partners, distinguishing its approach from that of other countries that may see them as proxies or pawns. But he should have been asked what those countries are that view Africa as a pawn. Undoubtedly, they are the Western countries, and the biggest of them is the U.S. Negating what it plans to do makes the position even more exposed. Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. Austin said that a common thread runs through these diverse areas of cooperation: our shared interest in a secure, resilient, and open Africa governed by laws and rules that foster prosperity for everyone. But he must be asked why the U.S. feels it should set the standards of how a successful Africa would look like. Why does the US consider itself an authority to direct and order African countries on what they should do and should not do? Adhering to the theme of cultural imperialism, the US Defense Secretary sought to guide Africans, implying ethical superiority and, at times, suggesting an assumed intellectual inferiority. He conveyed, "And Africa needs civilian leaders who keep faith with their citizens and heed their voices." That was an insult. It meant Africa was incapable of deciding what was best for it. Applauding the Biden administration's strategy for sub-Saharan Africa, the Secretary underscored the need for effective, legitimate, and accountable militaries to bolster open, democratic, and resilient societies while countering destabilizing threats. The core principle emphasized is that militaries exist to defend their people, not defy them, highlighting the imperative for African militaries to serve their citizens. Again, it was patronizing. So, does it mean the US is preparing to build more military bases in African countries? Analysts and those who can read between the lines say the US is trying to push Russia away by strengthening its position in Africa. However, it has forgotten that the days of colonialism are over. African countries cannot be controlled by military bases. Rather, if the US wants to win favor, it has to honestly assist Africa in a real sense. Instead of building military bases to quench its thirst for security, the US should work for development and infrastructure in Africa. Yet we see the US doing the opposite and African countries falling prey to the US plots. He visited 4 African countries, including Djibouti, Angola, Somalia, and Kenya, which means these countries have already accepted what the US wants. You should know that these countries already have US bases, and furthering deepening defense relationships means allowing more bases to be built. This is being done so the African countries who are getting rid of the West's influence can be blackmailed and strong-armed once again. Austin specifically called out African military juntas without explicitly naming Burkina Faso, Gabon, Mali, or Niger. This marked his most assertive rhetoric since the military intervention in Niger, where the elected president was removed in July. He emphasized the detrimental impact when military leaders prioritize personal ambitions over the rule of law, asserting that militaries exist to defend, not defy, their citizens. But the truth is that military juntas never allow the US to give orders, and they never listen to the US orders. They know how to keep it in its place, and that's what we are seeing in Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso. Recent developments, such as France's decision to withdraw military forces from Niger by year-end, raise questions about the future US military presence in the region. Analysts suggest the US may follow suit if the Nigerian military does not restore the elected government to power. Niger's strategic importance in counterterrorism operations for the US and France adds complexity to the situation, potentially impacting regional security. Despite this, the US has maintained its forces in Niger, but the Pentagon has declined to conduct counter-terror operations with Niger's military. But will the US succeed in manipulating Africa? Well, in contrast to previous occasions, which overlooked sub-Saharan Africa, Austin's trip aimed to reinforce the Biden administration's commitment that the US is all in for Africa. Despite Africa's marginal position on America's foreign policy agenda, Washington continues its efforts to strengthen connections on the continent. The US is keenly aware of Russia's recent influence in the region and China's prominent presence in numerous African nations. In response to what the US perceives as harmful activities, Washington has recently adjusted its approach. Austin's visits to Djibouti, Kenya, and Angola were part of a broader initiative by high-ranking American officials to engage with Africa. Earlier in the year, Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen, First Lady Jill Biden, Secretary of State Antony Blinken, Vice President Kamala Harris, and UN Ambassador Linda Thomas-Greenfield all visited various African countries. These efforts show America's wider re-engagement with Africa amidst growing competition for influence in the region. The U.S. Defense Chief initiated his tour in Djibouti, a small nation known for hosting a dense network of foreign military bases at the mouth of the Red Sea, including Camp Lemonnier, the sole permanent U.S. military base in Africa. Since 2002, this facility has represented the strategic partnership linking the two countries in the critical field of defense and security, a topic Austin discussed with Djibouti's President Ismail Omar Guelleh. Both nations are reportedly considering expanding the base's mandate beyond its current focus on fighting terrorism, extremism of all kinds, and maritime piracy. This means that Djibouti has bought what Austin was selling: false promises. Discussions continued in a similar vein during Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin's visit to Kenya, where he expressed appreciation to his counterpart, Aden Duale, for hosting U.S. forces at Manda Bay. The defense cooperation between the two nations was further solidified through a newly established 5-year agreement. This agreement delineates the path for enhancing Kenya's leadership in providing security within its sub-region and beyond, notably in Haiti, where Kenya is positioned to lead a multinational security mission. The accord includes comprehensive training and extends financial and technical assistance to Kenya, positioning the country as a privileged partner among select African nations that have signed defense cooperation agreements with the U.S., such as Rwanda, South Africa, Senegal, Nigeria, and Ghana. Despite the optimistic language, concerns persist in these countries regarding the actual benefits of such agreements. In Ghana, for instance, former President Jerry Rawlings and former Chief of Defense Staff Joseph Nunu Mensah argued in 2018 that similar agreements do not align with Ghana's national interests. They argued that the U.S. sought to compensate for the absence of AFRICOM's headquarters in Africa, currently located at Germany's Ramstein Air Base, by using the country as a staging post for military operations across the continent. However, Secretary Austin's visit went beyond defense cooperation. In Djibouti, he introduced America's new strategic approach for Africa: defense, diplomacy, and development. This rebranded approach aims to position the U.S. as the preferred partner for African countries, presenting itself as an alternative to China and Russia. In contrast to the August 2022 U.S. strategy towards sub-Saharan Africa, Austin emphasized that the U.S. does not compel countries to choose between them and other nations, particularly referring to the Chinese base in Djibouti. This shift appeared to echo Russia's diplomatic stance, highlighting a balanced approach for mutual interest. But risk cannot be taken by wrongly trusting the U.S., which has a history of breaking promises. The final leg of the tour in Angola took on a more political tone, while acknowledging security cooperation with Angola as a highly valued partner and a rising leader in the region. Austin's speech at the Historical Archive of Luanda delved into broader aspects of American involvement in Africa, including conflict prevention, female empowerment, cybersecurity, the fight against infectious diseases, and climate change. This programmatic address, or vision of a partnership of principle and progress, was directed at a larger audience than the ministers and ambassadors present. Secretary Austin, with his personal background highlighted, conveyed the idea that Africa matters for common prosperity and shared security, presenting the U.S. as genuinely committed to its engagement. Yet, this has shown that until now, and possibly in the future, Africa won't matter. Coming to an African and saying that they matter conveys how the U.S. thinks about African countries. Even if this speech was aimed at building bridges and addressing concerns of rising anti-neocolonialism rhetoric across the continent, it showed the opposite. Not content with merely being first among equals, Timofey Bordachev delves into the colonial dilemmas confronting the West. A striking parallel to America's global approach, similar to its stance in Africa, lies in how Washington presents itself as distinct from other potential partners. In this context, the Secretary of Defense affirmed that the U.S. perceives African nations as partners, contrasting with other countries that may regard them as proxies or even pawns. At this point, everything depends on how African countries respond. Although the 4 visited African countries by Austin seem to have fallen prey to U.S. tactics, the remaining African countries have to be careful. History has shown that the Western powers can never be trusted, no matter how honest they appear. After decades of struggle, the African continent is coming out of Western influence. At this particular time, the U.S. wants to dissolve this, dooming the African continent. Therefore, African leaders should maneuver this situation into such a war that the U.S. stays a partner, much like China and Russia, without becoming highly dependent on it. What do you think? Should African countries engage with the U.S. on security and defense? Isn't it true that security deals mean more American bases in Africa? In the comment section right below, Let us know your thoughts on whether Africa should collaborate with the very country it needs safety from. Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If yes, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.